So as you might have heard, we currently have a worldwide refugee crisis, specifically with Syria. Many Syrian refugees needing to move into areas of the world outside of where they live, which is a war zone, basically. And in America, here, we were very worried about bringing in refugees. Many people speaking out saying we shouldn't allow them in, or if we do, it should be a very small amount. And that was before the terrorist attacks in Paris, despite the fact that so far none of the terrorists who struck in Paris were refugees, let alone from anywhere, let alone from Syria. Now, afterward, even more Americans, the majority, in fact, saying we should not have refugees in a poll that I saw today. Many politicians, members of the media, saying we should not let them in. And this is, I believe, outside of... I mean, we've been letting in many Iraqi refugees. I don't think people even really aware of that. We've let in something like 20,000 in the past year. I don't think that people have been as aware of a refugee crisis in a long time. So they might think that this is some unique thing, and they don't understand that we've seen this sort of pattern play out before. And so we're going to talk about some of the media responses to refugee crises in the past to show that this is not necessarily all that dissimilar from other things that America has done in history. So here you're seeing, it pains me to say, but a Dr. Seuss cartoon talking about the potential danger that Japanese refugees would pose during World War II. Right. So you see them on their way to... Sort of weird that it looks like they're actually coming through America and then getting the TNT. It seems like they would have been sent with the TNT. But anyway, and that was the sort of fear that led to the internment of the Japanese. And a state legislator, actually, I don't know if you saw this, but he said that we shouldn't let in Syrian refugees, and it's totally fine to not let them in because we've already had policies like the internment of the Japanese. So he saw that as a good thing from our past. I would say it's one of the downsides of, or one of the worst historic moments of American history.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's sad, and we're going to kind of go through some more of these sort of representations of our refugee policy, and it's sad that we kind of overall, at least initially, have a fairly xenophobic kind of approach to a lot of these situations. And that's really unfortunate. Yeah,
exactly. I think I might have actually I might have called them refugees. There, it's more of an immigration thing in the case of the Japanese. And so we had the internment, despite the fact that there were way more Americans of German descent. They weren't being rounded up. My own family, some of them of German descent. But we, for some reason, we weren't considered to be potential dangers at that time. So in this next little news clipping, you're seeing fears of Cuban exiles being brought in. America has been suspicious of people of Hispanic or Latino descent for a long time. We don't like Cuba. We've given a pass to the Cuban exiles, so were they not merciful in that regard, but there were fears of what they could represent.
I think you bring up a really good point about comparing how we treated some of the people in the Japanese internment camps, as well as the Cuban, and how German people of German descent weren't treated the same way. It's because we have a hard time discovering, or getting used to people who look different than us.
Yeah.
Because Germans, it's hard to kind of
they
not discern.
Well, especially because they were a fairly large part of the population. Like, we thought of America as being Germanish, kind of, to some extent. Now, that's not to say that we haven't been xenophobic against some of the what are now considered white, like the Irish, the Italians.
You're about to get to a graphic,
exactly,
I think.
There you go. So we got the Japanese, we've got the Cubans. Here we've got, back in December 14th, 1938, the question of Jewish refugees. If you know anything about history, you know that it was pretty important that we find a place for these refugees to live. But students in this poll, and Americans largely, a very large percentage, were not at all interested in Jewish refugees from Central Europe being allowed into America.
And that's a different thing. That's anti-Semitic, not just necessarily not liking people who don't look like you, but that was more of an anti-Semitic thing. And it just shows you these people can be coming from horrors of being gassed, or the horrors of what they might be experiencing in Cuba and things like that. And we're like, well, sucks to suck. And that's not a way that we should, I think, respond to other humans, regardless of their descent or religion or anything. And that's really sad that we're seeing some of those same themes now. Yeah, exactly. And at the time, there were fears that the Jewish refugees could have spies or could have terrorists amongst them. And these are people that were trying to flee, at that time, one of the worst conditions that had ever been seen in any place. And
obviously, the inability of finding places in advance of the war to take them out led to a number of deaths.
Yeah.
And that's the same sort of thing that we're seeing with Syria. The people fleeing Syria are not ISIS fighters. They're people who don't want their family to be slaughtered by Assad or Al-Qaeda or the offshoots or ISIS. They just want to save their families. That's the history of America, is people fleeing here to avoid some of the other dangers in the world. And especially in reference to the Jewish refugees, like, we've been through this before, and so we should know better. And it's unfortunate that we do not. And as I said, so we're more aware, I think, of this particular refugee crisis and the potential people that we might bring in, even if the number is really small. It's something like 10,000 people over the next year is currently what we're going to allow in. We let in many immigrants and refugees every single year. We've let in something like 700,000 refugees in the past 15 years, and not one has been tied to any domestic acts of terrorism.
Right.
So the idea that, like, well, we don't know what might happen, we have a very good idea of what might happen because we've been doing stuff like this for a long time. We just forget that because now we're scared of ISIS. Which is it's sad. It's
a scary organization. That is true, but just because they may look the same or come from countries where they came doesn't necessarily mean that they're like associated with it. And people have a hard time separating those two facts.
Yeah, exactly. And as we talked about on the Young Turks yesterday, the refugees that would be coming in from Syria aren't getting on a boat in Syria and then getting off in America. These are people that have been vetted through Europe already. They go through a number of different checks over a course of 18 months to make sure that they don't pose any threat to us. They would be very carefully selected and then brought here. But if you listen to the politicians, we're just going to let the doors to the country open and 1 million people are going to come in.
We're flying them all on a big blimp from
Exactly.
Syria.
A gigantic,
anybody
scary
who
blimp.
wants, come on in.
Exactly, yeah. And so look, this is just 3 examples. There's many of these. We've been scared and hesitant of pretty much every group that's ever come over before. In fact, the only time immigrants were not openly met with hostility was by the Native Americans when the first Americans came, and that's when they should have been suspicious. But they weren't, unfortunately, and tragically. So anyway, let us know what you think about this. What do you think should be our policy going forward? Do you know of other examples in which immigrants or refugees were met with either suspicion or hostility? Post that down below. I'll see you in the next video.